We've seen over the last few weeks a much increased tempo of very effective strikes by Ukraine deep inside Russia, beyond the range of Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles. And I suspect the conversation behind closed doors is that this is not about giving Ukraine a military effect. The danger is that the overwhelming issue is political, that actually by giving Zelensky permission, that political intent inflames Russia. And therefore, why would you do that? If there is another way of giving Ukraine the capability they need, which is the technology and the components, then maybe they can build them for themselves and potentially do it a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, and a lot more effectively.
If we do get confirmation that the West will allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles to hit targets inside Russia, how big a difference will that make, Sean? I'm conscious of the fact that for months we were talking about the F-16s potentially being a game changer. And in and of themselves, yes, they will make a difference. Some might say they're making a limited difference already, but they're not going to transform the war. There's no one game-changing weapon. But how significant would you say the Storm Shadows are?
I think less significant than possibly we in the media are sort of painting them out to be. I think if we go back to the F-16s, I think they could have been a game changer, but for the fact that Ukraine has so few pilots that are trained to operate them. If rumours are to believe, there's less than single figures of pilots. So it doesn't matter the fact that they've been promised 85 F-16s. If you've only got a dozen or so pilots, then there's very limited effect you can actually achieve. I think the weapons front, though, is interesting because I have no doubt at all that the supply of weapons, let's take Storm Shadow, because that's one of the weapons we talk about. In big handfuls, I think the UK bought about 1,000 of those 30 years ago. It cost about 2 million each. I think in the intervening period, we've used less than 200 of them in actual conflict. It got to the stage where they were time expired and we therefore needed to upgrade them. We've decided to upgrade not all of those that are remaining. I understand it's only a few hundred to be upgraded. And that left us with several hundred of these missiles that we either disposed of, that would have cost us money, or we stored them, that would have cost us money. So one of the options when the war happened was, yes, we can give these weapons to Ukraine. It saves us money, but also because it's 30-year-old technology, we're not that worried if that falls into the Russians' hands. My point being, though, it's a very limited supply of those weapons. And my understanding is that Ukraine's had most of them already. So the fact that if they gave them the permission to use them even further inside Russia, Ukraine would still be faced with this very limited supply. I think the story that's happening behind the scenes, much more important is that either you make or buy. And if you can't buy something, you have to make it. And one of the things that's interesting at the moment is Ukraine seems to have developed its own Skunk works, its own way of rapidly developing weapons. It's developed its own ballistic missile, and it's developed its own long-range drone. Now, you can't just suddenly magic that from nowhere. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the West is providing technology and components, but now they're a lot easier to provide in bulk. As long as President Zelensky's team can put them together, if you're in the West, you'd have to do a whole lot of safety cases. You'd have to make sure that you did loads of test flying to make sure that they were robust and credible. That can take years. If you're in Ukraine, you don't do any of that. You bolt them together and fly them on a mission. So I think and we've seen over the last few weeks, a much increased tempo of very effective strikes by Ukraine deep inside Russia, beyond the range of Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles. And I suspect the conversation behind closed doors is that this is not about giving Ukraine a military effect. The danger is that the overwhelming issue is political, that actually by giving Zelensky permission, that political intent inflames Russia. And therefore, why would you do that? If there is another way of giving Ukraine the capability they need, which is the technology and the components, then maybe they can build them for themselves and potentially do it a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, and a lot more effectively.
It's interesting, Sean, you mentioned earlier the three pillars, we believe, of Volodymyr Zelensky's victory plan. And one of them is about having a consistency of supply when it comes to weaponry, because at the moment it's been very stop-start, a splurge of military aid from the US and then nothing for several months, and then maybe the Storm Shadows, but after a bit of a wait, and then maybe the F-16s, etc. How do we resolve that? Because, of course, even though it would be nice to think politics doesn't come into it, domestic politics in the US, domestic politics in Europe and the UK does come into it, and that has caused issues with the supply of military aid.
Well, it goes back to an earlier question, James, and I'll have a go at sort of tap dancing around it a bit because it's very inflammatory. Part of that is, what are the prospects for Ukraine? At the start of the war, it looked like Russia was going to push right in. Then Ukraine in October 22 managed to push a whole load of the Russians out in the Kharkiv region. 23, much vaunted spring offensive didn't come to anything. 24 will be remembered for Russian pushing forward. Now, if you look at it really in a binary form, Ukraine wants to get rid of Russians from every part of its territory. Does that prospect look more or less likely today than it was a couple of years ago? Frankly, it looks a bit less likely. As a result, how will this war be brought to an end? One option is that, because clearly, ultimately, it's up to President Zelensky to decide. But he's not the only stakeholder in this because he's relying so heavily on the support of the West, not just physical support, but moral support, particularly, as you say, domestically. All the countries are questioning, should we be spending so much money over there when we've got our own requirements here? And I think you're seeing a gradual erosion of the hope in the West that Zelensky can ultimately prevail. And even some of the language around this is starting to talk a little bit more about how you position Ukraine ready for that negotiation. My worry about all of that, of course, is that ultimately that rewards President Putin for his aggression one way or the other. And that has profound implications for global security. But I do think it's inevitable. We're living in this country. We've just had the winter fuel allowance. We've had all debate about money, that there isn't any. So therefore, the prospects of continuing to spend a lot of money in Ukraine, whereas we have lots of domestic needs as well, is really difficult. And finally, on the weapons front, bluntly, if you want to get a load of high-tech weapons built, it costs a lot of money and takes years to get the facilities set up. Is the government going to do that in this country, given that if it thinks that in the next year or maybe two, that the war will be brought to an end, you've developed this whole defence industrial base at huge cost, which then goes, what do we do with it? And it's all very well saying that we can build our own weapons. Let's be really clear. The weapons we're giving Ukraine are not the state-of-the-art weapons that we have in our inventory. We will not do that because we do not want to compromise our own national security. So if you're going to develop new production lines, you've got to develop production lines to build slightly older weapons or slightly less capable weapons that are not cutting edge. That is not easy to do, given the pace of modern technology, to retrofit sort of capability. So it's not as easy as it sounds just to ramp up domestic production.
And there's also the point about, okay, there's been a lot of focus on Storm Shadows and F-16s, offensive weaponry. But actually, Ukraine still desperately needs more air defense systems. Whether there are enough Patriot missile systems, I don't know. But you've got F-16s currently now having to do almost a defensive job on air defense when a lot of the Ukrainians were hoping they would be an offensive weapon.
Yeah, and I think that the F-16 is an interesting one because as a former fighter pilot myself, I never saw the F-16s being something that was going to be decisive in this conflict. Given the time it takes to develop your pilots, your training, your engineers training, the support, it felt like when the war is over, that Ukraine would need to have its own credible military capability to defend itself, to deter further aggression. And fast jets will be a key part of that. So what the West was doing was, let's not wait until the war is over before we start doing that. Let's start training their pilots so that when the war is over, very much quicker, you can give a credible deterrent. I think what happened, though, was as the war dragged on, who'd have predicted that we'd have been, still here in the midst of a war like this? I suspect they thought, right, the Dutch and the Danes were prepared to give their F-16s. The initial pilots were being trained. Why don't you start to use them? And when you do use them, the danger is they're very likely to be shot down by their own side, because Ukraine hasn't got a very integrated air defense system. It's not got a credible military jet presence. So bluntly, the guys in the front line, if they see a jet, they'll shoot it down because it will be Russian. So you've got to be really careful before you start putting Ukrainian jets into harm's way. And let's face it, the one that we've heard has already been shot down sounds like it was shot down by Ukrainians. So that sort of reinforces my aim. Going back to your point about air defense, though, I think the problem is Patriot sounds like the answer to the Maiden's Prayer, but they are millions of dollars per missile. You just can't, they're never going to be available in sufficient quantities to shoot down everything. And again, you're back to how do you have a layered system so that when the Shahed drones, these little cheap and cheerful drones come across, they need to be shot at the sky with cheap bullets. And then you have a layered system that gradually works out and save the Patriots for the really difficult tasks out there. That's a layered defense system. That's what President Zelensky's been appealing to the West, and the West has been providing a whole spectrum of different weapons to help him with those different threats.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.